Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where the smallest minority is the individual. This is episode 70, and we're going to talk about peak woke. Are we there yet? So, woke is a term used to mean that one was politically conscious and aware of things like institutional racism, understood in the traditional sense. That is, there is white supremacy, there is no meritocracy, there's white privilege, and anything associated with black is bad. Even, for example, why does the white ball have to hit the black ball to win in 8-ball? Right. And you might think that I'm stretching things a bit. No, my first race instructor had that as um, one of the examples of white supremacy and racism against African Americans. I guess we're not going to talk about 9-ball or other forms of pool, but anyway. So to be woke is to be aware that there are systems which are prejudicial by favoring some people over others. It's probably slang, obviously, coming from early 20th century music, 1938, I believe, some of the songs that were written back then. And then it was reused, I think, around in the early 2000s. And so people started running with that. So it's not wake up, right? So in other words, you're still asleep. So wake up, but the state of already awakened, right? So you're woke. So you became awakened or enlightened in the past. And so therefore you are now woke. You're not asleep. You're not going along with the system. You are woke. So if we're going to be purists with this definition, with this understanding, then obviously what is woke today is not what was meant before, right? So whether or not there are still some people who subscribe or maintain the original meaning, that is anti-Black, discrimination, oppression, that type of thing. There may be people who still believe that, but I think the term has gone on to encompass much, much more, just like how the original Occupy Wall Street movement in the late 2000s, around right after the mortgage crisis of 2008, just like the Occupy Wall Street movement was co-opted by socialists. So I believe that the woke expression has been co-opted by far more people who have very little concern about institutional racism against African Americans or Black people. So some of the things that are included in a lot of this woke phenomena, which you should realize has its roots in neo-Marxist ideology of a bifurcated society, right? So Marxism basically says society is all about a two-tiered class system, oppressor and oppressed, which is a huge generalization, and in fact, a very, very bad generalization, because within it, there are other classifications which are hidden because of the emphasis on this simplified two-class society of oppressor and oppressed. And if you read, and I don't know, I forget if I mentioned this before, but if you read a lot of the Marxist influenced race literature around 2000 to probably even 2010, you'll see that the writing begins talking about color discrimination, but somewhere there's a sleight of hand trick made where you're no longer talking about color-based discrimination, but you're talking about Marxist oppression of the working class, the proletariat. And if you read carefully, you can see when they do that. It happens almost without fail. So you begin with this very oversimplified vision of society, ignoring a lot of the contradiction and the exceptions to create a semi-accurate narrative based on semi-accurate details that's very, very subjective to persuade people that something is subjectively valid, especially because you know that no one is going to be fact-checking you, right? So you're going to create some kind of narrative of oppressor and victim, oppressor and oppressed, and you're going to do it by creating I should say, a narrative or a story which sort of justifies, your claim that this group of people, this racialization has been victimized. And you can do it with confidence as long as you do it loud and you do it with confidence, because then you know that no one is going to fact check you. And the reality is that most people haven't fact checked this kind of material because no one really cared, except for the people who needed to get a grade or people who were trying to get a degree, particularly a doctorate of some kind. And so enough people have gone down that road that I think they've reached a certain level of, how shall I say, a number of people where DEI becomes something that spreads beyond the university campus, right? So the things that you normally would only hear in university classrooms now becomes openly spoken, repeated, even in high school classrooms, in elementary schools. So DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so a lot of the things that were spoken only in the secret spaces of the university is now said out loud in the open, on the airwaves, everywhere you go, and it's supposed to be accepted as true. And what's really interesting, and a lot of people don't realize this, but diversity, equity, and inclusion also includes the assumption that all whites are racist from birth, right? So a lot of the race theory of before, and if you recall the episodes that I've done explaining race and the history of race, then you know that to claim that all whites are racist from birth ignores a lot of the arguments that were made previously in the old school way of explaining racism, institutional racism, and how can we sort of resolve and get beyond this phenomena of racism. Almost like piggybacking on the momentum created by DEI, you have BLM, or DEI came as a result of BLM, Black Lives Matter. And then you have trans activism, intersectionality, all topics which we've touched on before. That is promoting this phenomena of gender dysphoria, where young boys think that they are perhaps young women, and young women believe that they are young boys. And then you have this phenomena of intersectionality, where it seems like they're about to understand that a lot of their knowledge production is hypocritical and falls short of how far it should go, but then they don't quite get there. And of course they're not going to get there ever, because then it would delegitimize a lot of the activism that that's going on today. And then of course piggybacking on top of that is the whole climate change, where A lot of people today are boiling in the country in which they live, or we can call it summer, but it's climate change causes boiling. And then you have a lot of forest fires, which I don't know. It's because of the way that it's being sensationalized in the news and just how shady and suspicious a lot of the reporting on it is, particularly the government reactions to forest fires all over the world. It's just kind of interesting, particularly in Hawaii, Greece, perhaps Canada. It's very interesting. Almost makes you feel that there's it's a little sus, right? So the proponents of all of this woke, all the various aspects of wokeism, they enjoy a lot of power. And with power, of course, comes wealth and money. But they have enough power to change the narrative radically and still not be blasted for hypocrisy and the oppression of others. I mean, the open oppression of others, especially the imposition of one's religious beliefs onto others in the name of tolerance. And so what we're seeing with this whole wokeism stuff, which is a religion, right? It is a frame of mind which dictates morality, which influences decisions. Okay, so it functions as a religion. It's legalized oppression, right? And the things that we're seeing, particularly in the United States, where people who are disobedient and not following the narrative are punished either by losing their job, not having a contract renewed, being shadow banned, censored, canceled, deplatformed, assaulted. And while this is going on, the government is funding yet another failed military adventure in Ukraine while ignoring the needs of people here in the United States. For example, Hawaii. I don't know if you've seen that meme where Zelensky or Zelensky, whatever, Zenaze, right? I'll say Zenaze is sitting in front of a table full of hundreds, millions of dollars in $100 bills. And in the frame next to it, you see a Hawaiian, supposedly a Hawaiian young lady sitting in front of a table that has $700 on it and change, right? And if you haven't been listening to the news, it's rumored that Zenaze of Ukraine has bought a new house in Egypt, in addition to the house that he is rumored to have in Florida, which of course, millions of dollars, right? But of course, the Hawaiians who have no house any longer, they get $700. Also, you begin to see that the woke phenomena is being imposed on other countries. And so even countries which really don't want to hear about this woke stuff are forced to hear it because that's part of the aid package, right? So this military spokesperson for Ukraine is now a trans person. And if you accept money from the United States, then you have to incorporate it into your political propaganda and your education, right? That's how they do it, right? You want all this stuff, well, you got to do this too. And so it's kind of a bribe. And then if you want to stop doing it, then of course you get threatened that you don't get money anymore. So basically the United States is exporting wokeism overseas to other countries. And maybe it's not so obvious because of the reserve currency status of the United States. And we talked about that in a previous episode. So we have dollars going overseas to fund corruption. It was interesting. So it was always like this. The United States has been doing this since at least the 1950s with the Shah of Iran. But now it's sort of in everyone's face. And that's because the dollar is losing its purchasing power because of all the money printing, so-called, because of the inflation. Now people are feeling the effects of uh, monetizing debt or printing lots of money to cover expenses. So they're doing this on the one hand, and then on the other hand, not protecting the borders here in the United States. So all of this is going on. So how might we know that we have reached peak woke, right? As far as woke will go, are we there yet? Has the world gone crazy enough? Sort of become so hypocritical to be self-destructive yet, right? Are we there yet? One might think that you can gauge or measure peak woke by seeing successful pushbacks, right? So, for example, the banning of trans athletes in some women's sports, not all, just a couple, right? Where you have organizations saying, yeah, we're not going to let biological men compete against biological women anymore. Maybe we're going to look for the decline of schools which teach and promote wokeism, like colleges and public schools, right? So even the city where I live, the large urban city full of failing schools, they can't even teach math right, but now we're going to introduce woke material as well. Right. And so a lot of people seem to be trying to find alternatives to those failing public schools. So maybe that's an indication, right? Declining enrollments in colleges as well. Maybe that would be the indication that we've reached peak woke. Maybe we have to look for the obvious decline of countries which promote it, like in the EU, right? Many of those countries, particularly Germany, are going through hard times because they are doing what their masters here in the American government are basically requiring them to do. Maybe we can see peak woke when the violence and the looting and just the civil unrest in the streets in favor of the woke agenda gets too out of hand. Maybe that'll be enough to promote or to say that we've reached peak woke. Maybe it's when people who used to be supporters of this neo-Marxist woke agenda start sounding like the anti-woke, right? For example, I saw on X, Twitter, a lot of sanctuary cities now rejecting the illegals that they used to say they would welcome. There's too many of them now, right? So maybe that's an indication that we've reached peak woke. Things have gotten really extreme, and I know you know that there are really horrible, horrible stories out there. Like I heard one about a sorority that was forced to accept a biological male as one of their sisters, but he would, leer at them. So it's just totally absurd. Rape cases of rape as well. It's just unbelievable. Even the normalization of pedophilia in many ways, things that would have been considered a major crime is being normalized. It's unbelievable. Maybe that is an indication of peak woke. But unfortunately, I have bad news. I'm sorry. I tried to make this a happy ending, but I don't think we would know when the tide is turned or when we've reached peak woke until we start to see more and more people recognize that there's no value left in the US dollar, whether by inflation or the continually sending to Ukraine billions and millions of dollars while people in America are suffering. Until people finally say enough is enough and start doing something, and start recalling some of our invalid Congress people, right? Mitch McConnell had another brain freeze. I believe they're mini strokes, if I'm to understand it correctly, some sort of a variety of stroke, which basically means that he doesn't have a whole lot of time left. And yet still there's no recall election. There's no vote for competency. There's none of that. It's just kind of really, really interesting. So that's how you know we haven't reached peak woke yet, because the very politicians who are maintaining what we are seeing are not being removed from office, whether by force or by election. So really, we won't know that we've achieved peak woke until the dollar starts crashing, when the markets, the stock markets start crashing, where people's property values start crashing, when the economy starts tanking. Because until that happens, people will continually send money to Ukraine, continue to let illegals into this country, continue to fund projects to pay off voters, to continue to bail out banks and institutions which are part of the 0.01 percent of America, and continue to fund the police and military, who currently, very many of them are working against the interests of the people of the United States. Until we see the dollar crashing and all of that coming to an end, we really can't say with confidence that we are there yet, right? But if the dollar does crash, then people will have to start relying on each other again. And just as I mentioned in previous podcasts, that I believe that once the values and the true costs of a lot of behavior becomes revealed, people change on a dime. It doesn't take much for a lot of people to end their unproductive, violent, almost, shall we say, evil behavior, and people start cleaning up their act. So the dollar's got to crash, the value has to crash, because as long as people accept the value of the dollar, people will continue to do whatever it is they're currently doing and try to do even more. And so, sad to say, but at least that's the way that the subjective professor sees things. Sorry to leave you and on the weekend with a sorry note, but on the bright side, next week I'll be talking about my experience at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity conference happening in Washington, D.C. on Saturday, September 2nd, 2023. So I'll talk to you guys next week.